broad strokes, listen, you know the details, and these details, but I'm not taking a side on this, but if there was any, which a lot of people aren't really advocates of, but Trump, if anything, kind of, and whether he was a puppet or not, whatever you believe, he kind of normalized the Russian relationship, kind of, right, by becoming somewhat of a friend of Putin's. So between that time and the time that Putin, there was no NATO movement between the time after the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, what we did is then we overthrew the government of Ukraine.
So no, he came into Ukraine before.
We overthrew the government in 2014. USAID, which has spent $5 billion, which is a front for the CIA, which everybody acknowledges, went in there and started a revolution called the Maidan Rebellion, where there was these protests and ended with the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine that wanted to keep Ukraine neutral. Yanukovych wanted to keep NATO neutral. We wanted a pro-U.S. government. So we went in there in 2014, overthrew their government, and placed a government. And by the way, a month before the overthrow, we now have tapes that you can go on the internet and listen to. Victoria Nuland, who's the head of the neocons now, the deputy director of the State Department, choosing the new Ukrainian cabinet that will be put in place after the coup that was still a month away. So she knew the coup was coming a month in advance.
But who is she to us?
She's us. She's the head of the State Department. She's now, number 3 in the State Department. But she's been in the State Department. She's one of the, she runs the neocon program, which is, continual wars. So we then pick a new government. The new government comes in, immediately begins attacking the people of Donbass and Lugansk, who are Russian-speaking ethnic Russians. They banned the Russian language, there was 2 languages that were 2 official languages. Ukraine, they banned that. Violence immediately erupts, and they kill 14. There's a civil war. This war started in 2014. There's 14,000 ethnic Russians are killed. And Putin kept saying, you're killing our people.
This is Victoria Nuland. She has been serving as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the Biden administration and has decided to retire. She is often, depending on where people stand, criticized or admired for her extremely hawkish line on Russia. Her support for Ukraine was a driving force in USA's Ukraine war strategy. She has been a staunch advocate for the billions and billions in weapons aid to Ukraine during this war. Let's just say, without her, the wedge between Ukraine and Russia would not have deepened as much as it has today. According to the White House, her efforts have been indispensable to confronting Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marshalling a global coalition to ensure his strategic failure. For Russia, Nuland's departure is great news. They see it as a reflection of the Biden administration's failure of anti-Russia strategy. Victoria Nuland is currently the 3rd highest ranking diplomat in the US State Department, but she's hardly a diplomat in practice. As one European official once said about her, she doesn't engage like most diplomats. She comes off as rather ideological. You see, Nuland was Vice President Dick Cheney's advisor during the country's invasion of Iraq in 2003. She was a prominent player under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry when they were Secretaries of State. She's one of the most prominent neoconservative and anti-Russia voices in American power circles. Democracy and diplomacy are just mere words in her world of covert interference and color revolutions. Nuland is infamous for being involved in the 2014 Euromaidan uprising in Ukraine, which ultimately led to a coup against President Yanukovych, who was elected in 2010. And she's even more infamous for a particular phone call. While serving in the Obama administration, she had a phone call with the US ambassador to Ukraine, and this call was leaked. What was heard in this leak was shocking. It was Nuland casually calling the shots on who joins the new Ukrainian government, even deciding who becomes prime minister. Not only this, but at one point, Nuland would say,
"So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU."
She had supposedly said this about the European Union in exasperation with its soft stance on the anti-government protests in Ukraine at the time. So what happened here? You see, this call, quite obviously intercepted by Russia, did two things. It showed just how much disdain and disregard American foreign policy neocons have for Europe, and how deeply the US was involved in controlling the formation of the Ukrainian government after claiming in public that it believed that those decisions were for the people of Ukraine to make. This unmasked Washington's two-faced foreign policy approach, in the case of Ukraine, preaching democracy on the outside and murdering it behind closed doors. Victoria Nuland represents American foreign policy's most covert traits. An interventionist to the core, Nuland was always a step ahead to call for the most hawkish stance against Russia. Now let's wind back to 2013. The then Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych had been so far seen as a friendly leader by the West. All went well until 2013, when he broke the pattern and declined a political association and free trade agreement deal with the European Union. He had meant to balance ties with Ukraine's eastern neighbor, Russia, with this move. But more than the EU, it was the US which took great offense from this rejection, and thus began massive protests in Ukraine called Euromaidan. These protests were highly divisive in nature, vehemently pro-EU and anti-Russia. A bunch of US officials, including the State Department's very own number 2, Victoria Nuland, was seen handing food and cookies to the protesters. But as is customary for color revolutions, the peaceful protests soon broke out into brutal clashes which caused over 100 deaths. All this lasted for weeks in Kiev until one day Yanukovych's regime had been toppled. This episode stirred a lot of bad blood between Ukraine and Russia. It is said that President Obama was reluctant to confront Russia over Ukraine, but Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland coaxed their way through. Now, Putin was triggered. On February 22, 2014, 5 days after Viktor Yanukovych was removed from power, Putin launched the invasion of Crimea. Unlike anything we see today, this takeover was bloodless, and Russia was actually accepted among the people in Crimea. In Donbass, Russia stepped up its support for pro-Russia insurgents fighting for independence from Ukraine. On this front, the fight with Ukrainian forces had been ongoing for almost 8 years when in 2022, Putin launched an all-out invasion into Ukraine. So, you see, Victoria Nuland's school of thought triggered a domino effect beyond her pay grade at the time. But she was not done. Nuland has harbored ambitions to take the top job in the US State Department. She's been serving in the government for 3 decades, with only the Trump years being an exception. Now, under Biden, her ambitions peaked. She lost an internal power struggle. Nuland, once in line for the Deputy Secretary of State position, lost out to Kurt Campbell, who took office last month. Perhaps she saw this as the end of the road for her career.
Food for thought. US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland in Independence Square in Kiev, handing out parcels to anti-government protesters and security forces. Was it diplomacy from the woman credited with using a graphic swear word when referring to the EU in a phone call, which was allegedly hacked and ended up on YouTube? Her language was more tempered when she met the press.
Obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Nuland said she believed her reported comments, including apparently saying Vitaly Klitschko should not serve in any future cabinet, will not damage relations with the opposition. The phone call has overshadowed Nuland's visit to Kiev. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said the comments were totally unacceptable.
Some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the President Yanukovych.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent task. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
So, was it unprovoked?
Well, we did hear that a lot of times. I actually asked a research assistant of mine to count how many times we heard that in the New York Times in that first year from February 2022 to February 2023 in their opinion columns. It was 26 times unprovoked. Of course, things aren't unprovoked.
It's
that
almost
way.
A brand name, the unprovoked invasion.
It's the lazy person's dodge for actually trying to think through what's going on.
Yes.
And it's very dangerous because it's wrong. It gets the whole story completely wrong. And it misunderstands the trap that we set for ourselves as the United States to push Ukraine deeper and deeper and deeper into this hopeless mess that they're in right now.
Is there is no evidence, let me emphasize, zero evidence to support that argument.
Which part? That the imperialist part, the sense that he sought to conquer all of Ukraine and move on and conquer.
There's no evidence he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence beforehand that he was interested in conquering any of Ukraine.
I'm going to issue a challenge to Mike McCall and Mike Johnson and everyone. If you have proof that Vladimir Putin is going to march across Europe, going to go all the way to Kiev, take Poland next, and then keep on going, unclassify it. Declassify that proof and show it to the American people. Prove to the American people why they need to send their hard-earned money over there. Prove it. I dare you to prove it, because you do not have the proof. And they're not capable of showing it, Steve. This is the biggest, most repulsive scam, and it's been happening for decades, and it's all they claim to protect American jobs and to keep the military-industrial base going and employed, and it's all for our economy. This is not an economy anybody wants. We don't want an economy built on people's blood and dead bodies in foreign countries. We want an America first economy, and from now on, Steve, we are going to demand it from our Republican leaders. I don't care if the Speaker's office becomes a revolving door. If that's exactly what needs to happen, then let it be. But the days are over of the old Republican Party that wants to fund foreign wars and murder people in foreign lands while they stab the American people in their face and refuse to protect Americans and fix our problems over here.
And there's no way that an army that had 190,000 troops at the most, right, could have conquered all of Ukraine. Just impossible. As I like to emphasize, when the Germans went into Poland in 1939, and the Germans, you want to remember, were only intent on conquering the western half of Poland, because the Soviets, who came in later that month, were going to conquer the eastern half of Poland. So the western half of Poland is much smaller than Ukraine. And the Germans went in with 1.5 million troops. If Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue he'd need 3 million troops, because not only do you need to conquer the country, you then have to occupy it. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, he was not interested in conquering Ukraine, and that's why in March 2022, this is immediately after the war starts, he is negotiating with Zelensky to end the war. There are serious negotiations taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks, and Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating with both Putin and Zelensky to end the war. Well, if he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war? And of course, what they were negotiating about was NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the war. People in the West don't want to hear that argument, because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for this bloodbath that's now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be principally responsible. It wants to blame Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. So we've invented this story out of whole cloth that he is an aggressor, that he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and that what he did in Ukraine was try to conquer all of it. And he failed. But with a little bit of luck, he probably would have conquered all of it. And he'd now be in the Baltic states and eventually end up dominating all of Eastern Europe. As I said, I think there's no evidence to support this.
I think we have heard from Professor Mearsheimer a brilliant analysis of what the situation that we're in, and I agree totally with everything he has described. And I must say that in looking at things today, I cannot be optimistic. And first of all, I think that it has made clear that whatever happens in the future, Ukraine cannot be preserved as a, you might say, a viable and successful state within those borders that it inherited in 1991. And I say inherited because these borders were set actually literally by communists, and they include areas that had not been traditionally part of Ukraine. And the tragedy of Ukraine, one of them has been that as they were struggling, as all the other ex-Soviet states, to throw off the shackles of communism and all the irrationalities of that, they were confronted with a population that was deeply divided. And they were also subjected to a constitution which did not allow federalism, a federal system which would somehow give more local autonomy to different groups. So that you had a seesaw elections where by slightly more than 50%, the presidency would be won by one side or the other, and then that president would name all the equivalent of the state governors, the provincial leaders. That was a recipe for disaster. And because there was no leader coming forward, that really defined you might say, a new sense of Ukrainian statehood, which would be comfortable both to the Ukrainian speakers and the Russian speakers. So Ukraine's problem was internal. Now, as we have gone forward in our policies, I think that, as Professor Mearsheimer made clear, what we have to consider is not our analysis of the way things are, but what the Russian perception is. After all, people act on their perceptions. And the Russian perception is that we have aggressively attempted to detach both Ukraine and Georgia from any substantial influence by Russia. By the way, if another country had done something similar to one of our neighbors, we would have reacted, I believe, perhaps even more forcefully than President Putin has. So I think we have to bear that in mind. There's almost a hysteria today in condemning Russia as an unprovoked aggressor. Yes, Russia has been an unprovoked aggressor, but they had a precedent. What do you think the U.S. Attack on Iraq was? A country nearly halfway across the world, which did not threaten us and had not threatened us. We had attacked it, invaded it, cheered for our technology that enabled them. No images of how this affected the people on the ground. You know, I'm ashamed to say that the United States has given President Putin every trick in his playbook. Now, that doesn't make it right, what he has done, but we need to. Now, this attempt, in effect, to wage a virtually total war against Russia, I think is deeply and deeply misguided. We face so many threats, mutual threats. We're not over the COVID epidemic yet. This fighting and all of the refugees and so on, this almost certainly is going to make it worse. And we have the whole nuclear threat, which Professor Mearsheimer has described very well. And what about the long-term threats of global warming? How are we going to continue to deal with all these flows of refugees, whether they be economic or whatnot? We are simply undermining the real long-term interests of our countries in getting into this sort of fight. And I'd also say those who think we're simply going to choke Russia and bring it down should understand that this is going to have a serious effect on many other people. In my day, when I was in the Soviet Union had to import close to 30 million tons of grain a year just to survive. This was a tremendous liability, and it's one that we were able to use to pressure them in many ways. Right now, both Ukraine and Russia are net and major grain exporters. It tells you what the new system is like and how different it is from the Soviet Union, by the way. And this affects many countries. You start cutting off that trade. And also the trade not only in energy, but also in precious metals and other things which are essential for much of modern technology. I think that we're going to see, if we continue these policies, and it looks as if we're going to, a real pushback by people who are not willing really to take some of the cost to them for these sanctions, because they are there. And finally, I would say don't underestimate the Russian ability to in a fairly short period of time, to overcome some of the technological problems. I also think that the use of the dollar as a weapon, which is what we have been doing, is going in the long run to undermine our dominance of the world financial system. That may take a decade or two, but I think there are very serious implications, entirely aside from the nuclear threat, which is very much there. Though I agree with Professor Mearsheimer, it is not probable, but it is possible. And we have to worry about that.
This broke out in 2014. We couldn't blame ourselves. We couldn't blame the West. We couldn't blame NATO expansion. We had to create a new story that made the Russians the bad guys and us the good guys. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Russians became this highly expansionist great power, bent on dominating Eastern Europe, bent on recreating the Russian Empire or the former Soviet Union. But we were not thinking that way before February 2014. Our basic goal was to turn Ukraine into basically a pro-Western liberal democracy, to integrate it into the zone of peace. Of course, it backfired because we didn't listen to the Russians and what their concerns were after the April 2008 Bucharest summit. NATO has never said that Ukraine will not become a member of the alliance. This is a black and white issue. Either you say that or you don't say that. To say that it's not going to happen for a while, it might not ever happen, is not satisfactory to the Russians. The Russians are making it perfectly clear that we have to say that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And that has not been said. And you're implying that it has been said. It has not been said. This is a very black and white issue. The second point, we are arming the Ukrainians. We are training the Ukrainians. We have close diplomatic relations with the Ukrainians. We emphasize that we care greatly about their security, even if we won't fight for them. We talk about them in the context of our allies and partners. The rhetoric is used all the time. If you're on the Russian side and you see the Ukrainians being armed, you see the Ukrainians being trained by NATO forces, you see NATO leaders talking about Ukraine as if it were a de facto member of the alliance, you don't think this is going to really upset the Russians? You've been studying great power politics for a long time. You know how great powers behave. They're paranoid about their security. They intensely dislike the idea of another great power with its military alliance marching up to its border. So again, and this is a prescription for disaster. Now you say, maybe this is due to the fact that Joe Biden is weak. This crisis has been on the front burner for a long time. It started in February 2014, and Joe Biden was not the president. Barack Obama was the president, right? The crisis has gone on since then, right, to include the period when Donald Trump was president, and it continues today. And it is going to go on and on as long as we refuse to say some very simple words. Ukraine will not become part of NATO. Idea that Vladimir Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and that Russia today is the second coming of Nazi Germany is simply not a serious argument. Furthermore, nobody is talking about dismembering Ukraine the way Czechoslovakia was dismembered in October 1938 at Munich. That is not what is happening here. What we're talking about is effectively moving away from an effort on the part of the United States and its allies to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark. And if you're looking for an analogy here, the analogy is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets tried to put military forces in Cuba. It enraged the United States. And if you look at our relations with Cuba today, we still have sanctions on Cuba. We still have our gun sights on Cuba. Why? Because the thought that those Cubans would invite a distant great power into the Western Hemisphere bothered us so greatly then that it has continued to this day. That's the basic situation that you have in Eastern Europe today. The Russians don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO in the same way that the United States did not want Cuba to become an ally of the Soviet Union armed with nuclear-tipped missiles from the Soviet Union.
Do you think that there are any parallels, or do you subscribe to the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy?
Oh, I think that's a useful analogy. I think another one could be Austrian neutrality in the Cold War, a way of preserving Austria's sovereignty and independence, not undermining it, not undermining any important international rules, not incorporating a country into a particular military alliance. That is not a violation of any international rules and norms. And I think there's a bit of inflation, rhetorical inflation about the rules when I see members of the Biden administration or other leaders talk about a sacrosanct right of countries to join whatever security arrangements they desire. There is a right to apply, but the right goes only that far. There is no obligation by NATO to admit any other country. It would be absurd if that were to happen. NATO would collapse because a whole slew of countries would seek to join. They would automatically be admitted, and no one would believe that the Article 5 guarantee would be credible. So this is obviously not a way to run international politics.
I think there's no question that from Europe's point of view, it makes sense to have the Americans present in Europe. NATO is a net positive for Europe. the United States serves as a pacifier. There's no question about that. So you have a vested interest in keeping us in Europe. And this, of course, is why I have never once heard a European leader say that the United States should leave Europe or that NATO should disintegrate. Instead, European leaders worry that we will leave Europe and they will be left on their own. So I fully understand that it's in your interest as a European to have the Americans there. The question is whether or not it's in our interest. Now, I think when you look at the domestic political problems that we have at home, it is imperative that we focus much more attention and many more resources on solving our problems at home. Because if we're not careful, we're not going to be a liberal democracy much longer. You do not want to underestimate how much trouble we are in at home. And when you're running all over the world trying to solve everybody else's problems, this is going to detract in good part from fixing problems at home. So that's the first reason I've long been in favor of getting America out of Europe militarily. The second point I would make to you is that we face a peer competitor. You do not want to underestimate the fact that the United States pursued a foolish policy of engagement toward China during the unipolar moment. And in the process, we created a peer competitor. This is one of the greatest strategic blunders of all time. The United States of America helped to create a peer competitor. But that's where we are today. We have a peer competitor in Asia, China. We have no peer competitor in Europe. Therefore, we need to focus laser-like on on East Asia, and we need to pivot out of Europe. The only argument one can make for keeping American forces in Europe, in my opinion, is that we, in effect, work out an arrangement with the Europeans where we continue to serve as the pacifier, and in return, they agree to continue to work with us to contain China.
Jeffrey Sachs, economist, academic, and public policy analyst. Welcome to the global program of Hír TV.
Thank you so much.
I have the impression that your position about the war and the issue of responsibility goes against the mainstream narrative of the Western countries. So what is your position about could the war have been avoided and who has the responsibility?
Of course, there was no cause for this war or need for this war other than bad mistakes, especially by the United States government. Starting in 1992, when the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991, the U.S. entered a realm of arrogance, which is truly epical. And the idea that these leaders had in 1992 was now the U.S. is the world's sole superpower. It can do what it wants. Recently, a leading historian told me that he has found in the archives the plans for NATO enlargement in 1992 already, including Ukraine. So they already had the idea from the very beginning that NATO would enlarge and it would just keep expanding the U.S. military empire or the U.S. military alliance. At the same time, publicly, they had just told Gorbachev, not 1 inch eastward. But the arrogance is the essence of it, which is the U.S. is the sole superpower. Our late Secretary of State under Clinton, Madeleine Albright, said we're the indispensable country. It's quite a position for a country that has 4.1% of the world population. It's a little bit arrogant. But the U.S. started the NATO enlargement. Russia said no. The U.S. had the first wave, including Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. I think that wasn't so sensitive for Russia because these are countries far away, and the reason of the Soviet occupation had to do with World War II. It was a past. But then George W. Bush Jr., who started wars all over the place, also expanded NATO to 7 more countries, the 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And Russia said, stop, you're right on our borders. You're on the Black Sea. You're in the Baltic states. And in 2007, of course, Putin gave a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference where he said, you lied to us about NATO expansion. You keep doing it. You've got to stop. What did the United States do? Oh, it listened so well always. Next year, we expand further to Ukraine and to Georgia. And to my mind, adding in Georgia is really the ultimate clue, because not that it's so hard to understand any of this, but Georgia, not exactly a North Atlantic state to begin with, on the other side of the Black Sea in the Caucasus. But what was the U.S. program? The U.S. program was to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is an old idea. It actually goes back to the Crimean War, of the idea of France and Britain surround Russia in the Black Sea. So it's an old idea, but the U.S. idea was that NATO would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, completely surrounding Sevastopol, completely surrounding the naval fleet, making Russia, a nothing in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and so forth. Russia understood all of that. And in 2008, Putin told Bush at the Bucharest summit, don't do this. This could be disaster. And, by the way, the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, William Burns, a person we know today as the head of the CIA, wrote a memo which, of course, as in so many things in the United States, was secret. Don't let the American people know this, but it was leaked by WikiLeaks. And the title of the memo, Niet, means Niet. And the whole memo was to say, the Ukraine membership in NATO is at the deepest pain of Russia. It is the reddest of red lines. Don't do this. So Burns got that then. He gets that now, 15 years ago. But the United States doesn't listen. And then Viktor Yanukovych was elected 2010. His policy, very smart, by the way, neutrality. We're between two giants, so we need to keep the balance. But the Western giant didn't want to wait. It kept pushing, pushing, pushing. Then all of the protests at the end of 2013, and then Victoria Nuland, who was then our Assistant Secretary of State, gets on the phone to the U.S. ambassador and dictates who the post-Yanukovych government will be. Incredible. U.S. covertly overthrowing a government, or at least participating in the overthrow. The day that Yanukovych flees, when the government offices are violently stormed, there's the EU and the U.S. ready that day to recognize the new government. Not to say Yanukovych is still president, we need peace, he should come back, we should have elections, all the things that were agreed. No, the first moment we recognize the new government. That's what a covert operation to overthrow a government is all about. So that was the beginning of the war in February 2014. And then Putin pushed. He took Crimea, as he told Bush he would in this event, and he pushed for an agreement that would at least recognize the autonomy of the eastern Ukrainians, the Donbas region. And what's amazing there also is the Europeans were the guarantors of that. There comes Chancellor Merkel. This is France, Sarkozy and Merkel. We guarantee this. And the Ukrainians, they say it publicly. They said it to me privately. We have no intention of honoring this thing. And it's all a joke. Oh, it's all a joke. Yeah, it's a bad agreement. We're not going to honor it. And so we say the Russians, they don't do diplomacy. We do diplomacy, and then we ignore it. The Minsk II was actually backed by a unanimous vote of the UN Security Council. Never mentioned. In the US mainstream media, you wouldn't find a word of it because it's just propaganda pages right now. You have no background, no history, just complete amnesia. Then 2021, Biden came in, and he was even more antagonistic and more militaristic, more hardline, more neocon, as we say. 3 times in 2021, Biden, at a high level, said Ukraine will become member of NATO. So this is the provocation. At the end of 2021, Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security arrangement, December 17, and the main clause of it was no more NATO enlargement. I called the White House at the end of 2021, spoke to a very senior official and said, negotiate, avoid the war. You can avoid this war. No, Mr. Sachs, NATO is non-negotiable. And that's what they told Putin. You can read the minutes of the Russian Security Council meeting, February 21st, 2022. You can look at Putin's speech, February 21st, 2022, to the nation. He says, we tried to negotiate, but there was no one that wants to negotiate. You can argue, did he have other things he could have done and so forth, and absolutely valid arguments. But the main point is the United States, for 30 years, has pushed one line. We go where we want, when we want, where we want, and no one can tell us any different, including Russia. And you end up in war with that attitude. And then what's shocking to me, again, completely undiscussed in the United States, probably you couldn't find 2 articles trying to understand it. Zelensky said as early March, just a couple weeks after the invasion, we'll go neutral. And I spoke to senior diplomats that were all around that. Very interesting. As soon as he said that, the Ukrainians and Russians started to exchange papers. And actually, Putin said, negotiate. And there was draft agreement that was being mediated by Turkish Foreign Ministry. And I spoke to people that were involved in that. They were nearing completion of an agreement. And then the United States blocked it. They don't want peace. We need to weaken Russia. We need to defeat Russia on the battlefield. We need to expand NATO. This attitude is absolutely threatening to get us all killed, which is why I resent it so deeply. Because what do they think? That Ukraine's going to win in this counteroffensive and Russia's just going to sit there and say, oh, you're right, so sorry, we're going to go home, we're defeated, Ukraine's defeated us. Or Russia's going to say, we're going to escalate. And my belief is that they would, with good chance, escalate, and this could be complete disaster. And I don't think the NATO side, I'm speaking about the White House and the U.S. because it's basically been calling the shots on this. I don't think they've thought through this. So what happens? Escalation, 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 and then suddenly Putin says, okay, we stop, we fold, or we go to nukes. And it's absolutely a real prospect. And then we're told in the U.S. media, don't listen to Sachs saying about nukes. That's just scaring. That's nuclear blackmail. Well, the whole point is it's a real possibility. It's not about blackmail. It's about prudence, that you don't push your adversary to use nuclear weapons. That's the principle. And they don't adopt that principle yet.
Mr. Sachs, you, in a recent interview, you said that the Hungarian Prime Minister is the only European leader who has a realistic approach of the war. But the Hungarian Prime Minister, Mr. Viktor Orbán, seems to be very lonely with this opinion. And he's often accused to be a Russian asset or a puppet of Moscow or an agent of Putin. Why the Hungarian Prime Minister is so lonely with this realistic approach of the war?
I don't really understand why the European leaders who know better won't say better. Prime Minister Orbán says it, and he's right. And I know some others believe it, but won't say it. And I've watched even close up some of them. They say privately to me, yes, we know NATO's really a problem, and then publicly, completely the opposite. Or they say it publicly, and then they're smacked by the White House, and oh, no, we didn't mean that. We really meant we love every word you say, United States. So there's a lot of feeling that you just have to toe the U.S. line. I think, especially, okay, I can even understand psychologically, maybe the Baltic states, how they view this, or Poland, although I don't think they view it accurately, but how they view it psychologically, understandable. But I know, all the way back 15 years ago, in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, leaders then said to me, Jeff, what is your president doing pushing NATO enlargement? They knew. They said, and by the way, some of those now say exactly the opposite of what they told me to my ear. We were on the phone then. So I think Prime Minister Orbán is brave. He's saying the truth. He's hoping that the truth will make a difference, and that some of the others who know better but are not saying better will think a little bit more. And I hope, frankly, President Erdogan also will be clear. I don't think anyone understands the Black Sea issues and the path to safety probably more than Erdogan. That's their place. Turkey and Russia have been at it for a long time. They've seen all of this for hundreds of years. And that's why the Turks were so effective in the mediation. So maybe Prime Minister Orbán and President Erdogan and a few others, it wouldn't take many to say clearly inside NATO, come on, could we think a little bit before we just continue down this mindless, automatic path that is leading to Ukraine's destruction and threatening the world. And to my mind, this is the real thing. Outside of the NATO discussion, there's a whole world of leaders that agrees, which is very important. President Lula, for example, very vocally, very clearly. President Xi, no question. China understands, and China's, it's not a peace plan, but China's peace proposal says very clearly, we need an agreement that recognizes the security interests of both parties. What does that mean? It means stop the NATO enlargement so that both parties can find a path to security. Perfectly sensible. India understands, what are we doing? Wrecking the whole world over this phony principle of NATO's right to expand. African Union understands this. So the interesting thing is, if you add up the populations of the countries where the leaders get it, I'd say it's at least 3/4 of the world. Inside NATO, it's very few. Prime Minister Orbán's really exceptional because not only does he get it completely clearly, but he says the truth also, and which is very painful to do when all the others, even when they get it, are not ready to say the truth. And so this is the situation that we face. And the media have become, in the United States, the mainstream media, hopeless because there's no background provided to the readers at all. And I had a run-in with the New York Times on this because they keep saying the invasion was unprovoked, unprovoked, unprovoked. And I had an assistant of mine scan all their editorials and op-eds since the February 24th, 2022 invasion. And they wrote in 26 articles, unprovoked invasion. And I said, could you once let someone explain the other side? And so far, no.
Prime Minister Orban has made it clear that Hungary will not participate in these NATO efforts. And I accept this position. And I'm glad that today the Prime Minister and I have agreed on modalities for Hungary's non-participation in NATO support to Ukraine. No Hungarian personnel will take part in these activities, and no Hungarian funds will be used to support them.
We have time for two short questions. First, it's the Hungarian National Television. Thank you very much. Hungarian Evening News. Prime Minister, I would like to ask you, what is the guarantee that Hungary will not be forced or coerced by NATO into any undertaking in Ukraine? There are two guarantees we have. One is the Hungarian government, and the other is, of course, the Secretary General of NATO, who quite clearly elaborated that he does not have any intent to this end, and the Hungarian government has a very clear stance on the Ukrainian-Russian war. We are not children. It is not worth chasing illusions. This is a very, very difficult political issue. The whole invasion of Russia raises a lot of issues in the global politics as well. It is not easy in this situation to find the appropriate answers. And there will always be times, moments in time when decisions have to be made urgently, when there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. And one of these times are just now, the Secretary General has said, especially because of the NATO summit. In these decisions, we have been able to articulate the Hungarian position and to come to a fair agreement with the Secretary General. But as I've said, this difficult period has not come to an end. Once the NATO summit is over, there will be difficult moments when, again, there might be decisions, difficult moments that might raise the issue of involvement in the war in that phase. But those decisions will have to be made then. So I can only undertake any guarantee that I've done at the elections on Sunday. When the decision comes, when the moment comes, I will represent a position that is equitable for Hungary, and I will try to have that informed. Thankfully, the founding documents of NATO make it clear that for any out-of-area operations and participation therein can only be voluntary. And this is a right that has been quite clearly guaranteed by the Secretary General, repeated, reiterated. Therefore, Hungary continues to have a room for movement in the forthcoming difficult moments that might arise. Anyway, now let us rejoice that this discussion today has concluded with an agreement. Hungary has made it clear that she does not want to, and she is not able to change the decision of 31 other member states. And I'm very happy that NATO has acknowledged, through the person of the Secretary General, that Hungary wants to fully avail herself of the opportunity for a room for NATO movement for consideration that is guaranteed by NATO, and we've been given the guarantee today that when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian war, when it comes to military out-of-area operation, we do not have to participate in that Hungary will not provide funds or personnel for this war, nor will the territory of Hungary be used for any involvement in this war. So we have been granted everything that we have found necessary, we have deemed necessary. This was a difficult, but I believe very constructive discussion with the Secretary General. I'd like to thank him for this very correct agreement in the end.